Another episode of Messari's Unqualified Opinions. I'm Ryan Selkis at 2-Bit Idiot, and I'm very excited to have my dear friend, Aaron Wright, who's the co-founder of OpenLaw and a professor of law at Cardozo University. I've known Aaron almost since day one, at least day one since Ethereum. I think 2013 I got into the industry, but in terms of conversations with people that actually believe in this crazy thing called Ethereum, you got to be up there in the top 3 or 4 in terms of conversation.
I actually remember it. You sent me an email. We were putting on an event at Cardozo. You sent me an email and like, I want to be on the panel. We're bringing in Ben Losky.
Oh wow, there it was. Yeah, and I was not invited because you're smart and you recognize that probably wasn't going to be a good use of university resources.
If I knew you at the time,
you definitely would have said no. Yeah. So, we're going to talk about the legal autonomous organization, which is it's been panned by the usual suspects. It certainly presents an alternative to being in compliance with U.S. securities law and actually moving the ball forward with respect to autonomous entities or at least a new type of entity using crypto primitives. So why don't we start by just talking a little bit about the history, maybe a short history of the DAO, Ethereum's first, killer app that almost killed it, right. And why people have been so excited about these autonomous entities, and then what you're aiming to do with the DAO.
Sure.
And if we want to go even a little bit further back, maybe how you got into this whole industry and mess and for me this is kind of a natural extension of everything that you've been working on for 4 or 5 years now. So talk a little bit about everything that's gotten us to the point that we are right now, because it's one of the initiatives that I'm very excited about, if a little bit reserved in my excitement. So at least early on, just because there are so many things that have to come into place for this to actually take off.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll start with just the DAOs and Ethereum and really kind of this concept that folks have been interested in from the beginning. And it's really that, right? Since Ethereum was birthed into existence, there's always been this kind of related concept, and it actually predated Ethereum of decentralized autonomous organization or other forms of autonomous corporations or entities that rely on smart contracts to kind of manage the collection of some sort of votes for members and then the allocation of funds to various different parties. And the first great experiment with this was the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, which you can view of as kind of a first version of a venture capital fund that is completely in the sky, completely in the cloud. And the vision was really compelling to many folks, right? It was like, you should not need to go to Silicon Valley if you want to raise funding. You should be able to go to this entity, the DAO, and receive funding, particularly if you wanted to build something in the Ethereum ecosystem. Mm-hmm. It turned out that lots of folks were interested in that idea. My recollection was that the founders of the DAO were hoping to raise $500,000. They wound up raising $150 million, which today would be worth about $2 billion into this entity called the DAO. And it began to work, right? There was several proposals that went in, folks were beginning to participate in it, and it suffered from a tragic hack, which ultimately required that Ethereum fork and create 2 versions of itself, right? ETH and ETH Classic, and also it kind of ended that experiment. But this idea of a DAO, some sort of venture capital fund that exists in the sky on Ethereum, has really animated developers for quite some time. And so my background, just to touch base, I'm a professor at Cardozo Law School. I also run a project called OpenLaw. We've been building out kind of a layer that sits on top of Ethereum and other blockchains that enables us to tie legal agreements to any blockchain-based asset transfer. So you can take a legal agreement, you can sign it, and you can trigger lots of on-chain activity. So we've been trying to solve this problem, another layer on top of Ethereum that enables us to hopefully begin to do more complex, more sophisticated transactions on a blockchain and in particular on Ethereum. And this, is really something that we've been working towards from the beginning. So from the beginning of Ethereum, which I had the pleasure of helping to launch in a small way. There's always been this idea of not just building a bank, something to manage assets, but also managing commercial transactions more broadly. Smart contracts are fantastic at moving around assets, but as folks that are sophisticated know, you need to manage risk in different ways, and smart contracts are not great at managing risk. They actually create more risk. The way that we manage risk today is usually through contracts. So it's marrying together traditional contracts with this asset management system called a blockchain that lots of folks have thought from the beginning is really the two of the pieces that we're going to need to rebuild the commercial world. So that's largely built, and we've been rolling that out with lots of different folks, from the LSTA to other major trade organizations to law firms and various different other parties. And we've also been putting together and kind of supporting all these initiatives to start building limited liability autonomous organizations, or limited liability decentralized autonomous organizations. So we started working with them over the past couple months, and it occurred to us we should really resurrect this initial concept of the DAO. It was a great one. Everybody was interested in it. There was clear market demand for it. There was clear interest in it. But a lot like what we saw with Mt. Gox, which was the right business model, which was the right idea, it just wasn't done right from a security perspective, from a jurisdictional perspective. If we were going to look at the DAO, we should do it in the US the right way, much like how Coinbase and other exchanges did the same thing to Mt. Gox 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. So that's really the concept. The concept of the DAO is that we're going to be building and helping to support a venture capital fund that's running on Ethereum, but it's going to dot I's and cross T's and do so in a way that complies with US law. So it's going to be organized in Delaware, it's going to be operating in the US, and hopefully it's going to create this opportunity if you're a project in the Ethereum ecosystem to start and you need funding. You do not need to go to Silicon Valley, you do not need to come here to Silicon Alley, you don't need to leave the confines of your house. If you have a following online and people respect what you're doing, you can apply to the lab. Members can decide to propose that you get supported with funding, and then you can receive funding. And if all goes well, you could potentially receive funding in days instead of months or weeks or even years of going and talking to venture capital funds.
So that's kind of the initial promise of the DAO, right? Back when it raised all that money. But let's talk about some of the building blocks, right?
Sure.
Because OpenLaw is a project that you've been working on for several years now.
Right.
What are some of the foundational pieces of OpenLaw? Because we should parallel path this conversation so that it's DAOs on the one hand, but also the legal building blocks that marry wet and dry code.
Exactly.
Right? People talk about unstoppable contracts and code is law and things like that. And in the real world, that's not true. If for no other reason than these technologies are so mature. So there's a bit of playing catch up with the maturity and the reliability of the tech that's powering these contracts. But then there's also just coding these things in a way that is compliant and would actually be upheld in court, right?
Yeah.
Forget about whether something is capable of being rolled back. Some of these real world contracts that you want to automate, they're still going to exist and they're still going to be adjudicated in the real world. So what are the low-hanging pieces, low-hanging fruit and components that you focused on early on with OpenLaw and
Sure.
maybe starting from that, this would be like not even a law 101, but just some organization to the mass that is law that could be upgraded via smart contracts.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Where do you even start?
And really, it's a history lesson of cypherpunks, right? So
Mhm.
when Nick Szabo came up with this notion of smart contract in the late 1990s, it was amazing. Right? The idea was that you could use code to kind of represent the transfer of assets or contracts more broadly. Around the same time, Ian Grigg, who's done quite a bit of work in the space and with digital cash and money beyond that, he came up with a related concept called a Ricardian contract. And the idea is that if you have a legal agreement today, it should be able to be represented in a computer object so that it can be understandable by machines, by computers, by other computing systems, and that should be done in a cryptographically secure way. And at the end of even one of the papers that Ian put together describing this concept, he noted that this is going to be a complement to smart contracts, like the ones described by Nexava.
Mhm.
And it's really, I think in many folks' mind, this marriage of these two things, the wet and dry code, that's necessary for us to begin to build robust new commercial systems that are open, or more decentralized, more available, cheaper, and that's really the core concept of what we've been building with OpenLaw. So that is the legal building blocks that we've been trying to build.
Mhm.
And to do that, we built tools that enable us to take any agreement or any set of agreements, no matter how complex they are, and we can convert them into a data object, a JSON object, and we can also facilitate, once they're signed, the orchestration of any number of smart contract calls.
That's the theory. What are in practice, what are some of the easiest to automate legal contracts?
Yeah, so we'll give you a couple of examples, some simple and more complex. So
Mhm.
on the simple level, we've shown how a basic employment agreement. So let's say you were employing me, Ryan, you would enter into an agreement with me.
Very expensive.
But maybe we want to explore real-time payment, right?
Mhm.
We want to explore not just paying somebody every 2 weeks, but we want to use a smart contract to pay somebody every minute or every hour or every day.
Which is one of my favorite applications that has not
Yeah.
been built yet. And I still don't fully understand
we
why
built
not.
it.
but-
So we've already built it. So you can, using OpenLaw, you can take that very basic agreement, an employee
Mhm.
offer letter or employment agreement. You can replace and reference smart contracts,
Mhm.
and then we can handle the smart contract piece once it's signed. So if you wanted to get paid every minute, or if some of your workers wanted to get paid every minute, that's completely possible today. And all those risks that you worry about as a business owner, like IP, whether or not somebody leaves, representations and warranties, those are all covered by the traditional legal agreement.
Mhm.
The fun smart contract piece and move around assets really fast, you also get the benefit of too. So
And is that all open source as well?
yeah, so OpenLaw is an open source protocol. So the way that we create agreements that are data objects is open. The way that we orchestrate transactions is completely open as well. And the nice thing that we're able to do is schedule smart contract calls. So we can do these recurring type of arrangements. So that's like on the simple end of the spectrum.
Mhm.
On the flip side, we've also worked with the LSTA, which is the Loan Syndicated Trading Association. So
Mhm.
they handle really, really big loans to build buildings and other large projects. We work with them to automate a very complex revolving credit facility. So if you need to take on a big loan, there's usually an administrative agent that kind of facilitates that.
Mhm.
So we took their standard agreements, which are very complex, 70+ page documents, replaced portions of that with smart contract calls, and showed how that's completely feasible in a blockchain world and at a lower cost for the administrator. So those are kind of the more complex types of transactions that we've already been able to handle. We've also done smart derivatives, smart real estate. Really, any use case, it really has a strong legal component to it, and we prefer it to be palatable for folks in the real world that are managing risk and a lot of value. And so that's in part why we had this kind of what we view as a powerful engine to do lots of really fun commercial things, and we started thinking about the DAO space just in general. And we realized that in part there was a number of issues with the DAO itself that were not just technical, right? There were some legal issues that they ran into, and we figured with our tooling that we'd be able to begin to address it. And as we began to dig in more, we kind of had a eureka moment at some point where we're like, holy, we can actually probably
You can
comply
stand
with
with
yes. Well, I'm a respectful person. So we pretty much like, holy moly, we can actually solve a lot of the legal issues that the DAO had, and we also saw that there was a lot of innovation on the smart contract side. And by marrying those two developments together, we realized that we could resurrect this great idea, this great experiment, in hopefully a way that complies with U.S. law.
Is that an easy organization to replicate? It seems like anything that's handling investor funds and allocating capital with any expectation of return, that seems loaded in and of itself. Wouldn't it be easier to start with a basic nonprofit?
So we've already seen the basic nonprofit start. That's in part why we were encouraged by this idea.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a project in the Ethereum space called Moloch, which is it's not a not-for-profit legally, but it pretty much is a grant-giving organization.
Functions as that.
Yeah, it's raised a little over $1 million in Ether, and it's allocated out portions of that Ether to various different projects that are supporting the Ethereum ecosystem. Super cool project. It's got a lot of prominent backers, including Vitalik and Joe Lubin and some other folks. And in many ways, that experiment the mechanics of it, the way the smart contracts work, they translate really well into this venture model too.
Mm-hmm.
So we use that as a baseline on the smart contract side and extended it so that we can start to do more for-profit ventures. So in many ways, we've already gone past the era where we're going to need to kind of just experiment with this for not-for-profits.
Mm-hmm.
And using OpenLaw, we're able to start taking it kind of to the next level.
Are individual investors still restricted by accredited investor laws and what you'd expect from U.S. Regulations around like investor protections? And,
Sure.
and how do you encode that? Do you have to work with like a third party to do the KYC and accreditation, or is that just self-attestation?
So maybe we'll take a step back and kind of talk about the issues with the DAO itself, and then it can make a lot of sense. Was your question about Moloch though? Moloch does not do accredited.
No. A Moloch is just a grant-making entity, so I understand like the same functionality.
Yeah.
Obviously, you need to be able to do that if you're making investments, but it's more about how do you accept money on the way in.
Sure. So
for a legal
it's
entity.
It's a great question. Yeah, and so the DAO itself, the original version, not only did it have these securities issues, but the SEC basically weighed in on whether or not it ran into legal problems. And this kind of kicked off a lot of the legal issues that many token-based projects have been grappling with over the past couple of years. The SEC issued what's known as a 21A report. And that 21A report pretty much made clear that in the SEC's view, any interest in an entity that looks like the DAO would be considered a security for all intents and purposes. And what that means is if it's a security in the US, that only folks that are accredited investors, which is a real fancy legal term to effectively mean a rich person.
To screw retail investors.
Yeah. Well, that's fair too. Then another issue, you would have to be pretty much a wealthy individual or an entity with a sufficient number of assets to participate in those transactions. And so that means for the DAO itself, as an initial starting point, we're going to limit it to accredited investors. We think that there's some decent arguments that can be made to open this up to non-accredited investors. And I think over time we'd like to evolve to that. But our initial principle is we want to do this right. We want to do this in a way that we can experiment with some of these mechanics on the smart contract side and make sure that works before we kind of take it to that next step. A lot like what we saw exchanges do, where they were like, listen, we're only going to list Bitcoin first. But over the course of years, they've been able to expand what they've listed, and they've been able to kind of bring this idea of digital asset trading to the masses.
This is a framework, right? So is there an initial implementation of the DAO?
Yes.
What types of entities do you think will get spun up, and who will be the creators of them, right? Because just because this primitive exists, it doesn't mean that people are just going to dump capital into it.
Absolutely.
And put it on autopilot, because it still needs to be configured, and you still have to set the investment parameters or the general investment thesis. Like, how do you go from this primitive to creating an autonomous entity with rules that somehow does not look as if it's being controlled by one person or organizing body that is forking the code and then at least putting forth an initial proposal for how capital should be allocated?
Well, maybe let me unpack how the DAO is going to work off the bat, and then I can describe.
And let's separate like the DAO primitive from I don't know let's call it the WOW, like the Wright autonomous organization.
Yeah.
Right. So like whoever forks the code first. So separating VLAO as a concept from the first implementation.
Yes, so let's talk about the first implementation. So the first implementation that we're going to help facilitate, and we being OpenLaw, it's going to be modeled very closely to a traditional venture capital fund. And what that means is that there's going to be legal documentation in place, so that if you're an investor in the DAO, it should give you some comfort that this is done in a manner that you're familiar with. Members of the DAO will receive an ownership interest in the entity, and that ownership interest will enable them to collectively vote and decide which funds to project, which projects to fund. And that's the basic concept. This is kind of what we saw with Moloch DAO. A bunch of different folks contributed capital to it, and they voted collaboratively to decide where funding goes. We're going to have that same concept wrapped up in limited liability entities that are organized in Delaware and other jurisdictions so that people can contribute capital. They can receive an ownership interest in the entity. They can decide which projects to fund, and in return, they're going to get back an interest in the projects. And that interest is not going to be just a generic token, it's actually going to be tokenized stock. And we at OpenLaw are going to help facilitate that process in both ends of the equation, both the creation of the legal entity, as well as the creation of tokenized stock for projects. And by doing that, we think that we can begin to streamline dramatically the venture process to begin with. The LAO itself is going to start not investing every project. We're going to start at pretty much the seed stage. So we're going to try to fund companies that are early stage, or the LAO is going to try to fund companies that are early stage. And the terms of the investment are going to be provided on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. So if you want to accept investment from the LAO, you're going to do that pursuant to standard terms and conditions. They're not going to be negotiated. There's going to be certain requirements that you're going to need to hit in order to receive it. But at the end of the day, with this standardization, we think that we can drop the time it takes for members of the LAO to come and reach a decision as to whether or not they want to fund a project, and also delivering capital to projects that are in need of it.
How does the governance process work for this first LAO? Because in Moloch, you have concepts like you go to rage quit, right? So if you disagree with the direction of the grant-making body, you can just pull your funding.
Yeah.
Obviously, venture funds are not structured like that.
So the LAO will be structured like that.
Okay.
So we think that that's an important innovation. It enables folks to reach a collective decision-making, but at the same time, if you disagree with it, you should be able to walk away with your capital. So we'll be able to replicate that in the LAO off the bat. But to your point, in future versions of this, that may evolve. But maybe that's not an effective way for these funds to operate, but we want to experiment with that off the bat. So we should have rage quitting that's available, and other kind of minority rights baked into the smart contracts, such that if there's a large holder in the LAO, that it doesn't disproportionately influence the rest of the decision-making process.
If this goes as crazy as the first DAO, right out of the gates, you might say that's a good problem to have. I don't know if it is, because with the ETH 2.0 fork coming up, you've got all types of risks about where are the assets actually held. You can't double spend anything that's been committed to the LAO. And if there's any issue whatsoever with forking, whether it's around the 2.0 launch or in the future, and this is a similar problem, I think, with stable coins, how do you reconcile the differences, and how do you think about picking one chain versus another? Is that kind of incorporated into the governance, or is this just something that we're going to have to play by ear and figure out how it comes out?
I think everybody's playing by ear to a certain degree due to this network upgrade. But the one thing that I will say, the way it's going to be structured is that OpenLaw will sit as an administrator. So if the members basically direct us to do something, then we can begin to upgrade the underlying smart contracts or take certain steps to remediate those issues. And we think that that's the right answer here for rolling out DAOs more broadly. On the security side, for the DAO itself, it ran into issues in part because it was so decentralized. So what we're going to be doing is basically providing certain administrative services, and or we can interject if the members basically vote and tell us that we're committed to do that.
I'm assuming you're not getting a carry on this.
So we are not getting a carry. You can view us as software, right? And so for the software, we'll be taking a fee. That's going to deprecate over time.
So it looks more like an ETF structure than an actively managed fund. So in terms of the fee structure, and
I don't think ETF would be the right way to think about it. It's really just a member-managed venture capital fund that's relying on us as software to administer certain tasks and to help the members set it up off of that.
Mhm.
But the thing that's interesting, and this is kind of what we're pointing towards, there's certain restrictions on the size in which the allow can be off the bat. We're going to abide by those restrictions. So not everybody will be able to participate in the first version of allow. We'll be
Mhm.
limited in all likelihood to under 100 initial investors. But the model itself and the tools we've developed, we should be able to quickly spin up multiple allows. Right? So you can imagine if this works in the future, having a constellation of labs that are all available for folks to receive funding from. And the other thing that's interesting about what we're doing, we're helping 10 founding members basically set up the first lab, but we should be able, and we're still dotting I's and crossing T's on this, to do a public sale for the remaining 90 slots in the lab. So,
what are your expectations around quorum and decision making when it comes to actually allocating
The funding.
the investment capital?
Yeah, so-
and do the more active members get some type of outsized performance fee, or can you just have all kinds of dead weight in one person calling the shots if people are lazy?
yeah, so I mean, listen, we've seen this even with Moloch itself.
Mhm.
Participation in these entities is difficult to predict, and it's oftentimes lower than what people initially expect. So off the bat, we're going to require, just like in Moloch, a majority of the holders of the interest in the lab to approve an investment before it occurs.
Mhm.
And that's what's going to be kind of it's going to be set up to do. But over time, we can experiment with that. We can experiment with delegation, so folks can begin to delegate their votes to more active members. Even the right to vote could be tied to separate agreements that enable folks to earn profit off of this. Right? So you can imagine different scenarios where folks that are more active can get compensated more. Third parties could potentially provide advice on what to do and receive payment or a portion of whatever profits made. Lots of different things can be explored. I don't know if that all makes sense for me legally. Those are things we have to be very careful about, but we at least have a playground to begin to experiment with these ideas. And that's kind of the whole point, right? We want a place where we can explore using smart contracts to
Mhm.
manage some of the internal affairs of organizations. We want it to be for-profit, not just grant giving or people giving away money at a loss. If we really want to push this forward. And I think at the same time, we want projects to actually have a reason to have a security token, and that's something that's going to be important here too. So if you're a
Mhm.
project, you're going to set up digitally native, and we're going to help you do that, provide you tools to do that. So that means from the beginning, we can have plenty of wonderful projects in the Ethereum ecosystem and hopefully other ecosystems that have tokenized stock from day one. And we think that that's important as this ecosystem matures. It gives people an actual reason to use security tokens and not just kind of a forced one. And I think we're seeing other.
What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? My email. Just a tremendous amount of things.
For the structure in particular.
I mean, I think that there's a number of details that have to be worked through, but we've spoken to a number of different folks about this, both on the investor side, on the project side, and also on the law firm side. And I think that this is something that's we should be able to launch. We're excited to launch, and we think it's really a nice way to kind of capture that energy of what was available with the DAO itself, but to do so in the right way. And I think if we can do this, all of those fantastic projects in the space, hopefully the good ones, can receive funding really fast. They can be set up on Ethereum basically from day one, and we can begin to start really powering this ecosystem forward at an even faster clip. So if you have a great project, you know that you'll have a source of funding to receive funding from without having the need to go convince a venture capitalist, it's Silicon Valley or New York or some other major urban center. I mean, we saw this with Bitcoin. I mean, you remember this. Like, there was so many great Bitcoin projects in 2011, 2012, 2013. They couldn't get funding.
Mm-hmm.
Even though everybody knew in the space that it was going to be a big deal. And you could say the same thing about early projects too. So I think it's really great if we can begin to, pool these assets and begin to reward people for doing great work on these protocols.
Well, it'll be fascinating to see how it unfolds. When is the first close or targeted fund?
So we haven't set those dates yet. I'll make sure to keep you apprised of that. But it's moving very fast. Both at the technical side, we're largely done with what's needed to operate this, and then dotting I's and crossing T's, and hopefully we can make some announcements related to that shortly.
At DEF CON, where everybody's going to be making announcements. Target close, you heard it here first. So, all right, Aaron, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for coming in and chatting a little bit more about this. It's a fascinating concept if it works. Even in a very basic form, I think it's a very promising framework. So
if it works, it inverts the ICO market.
It does, and that alone would be exciting. There's so many kind of secondary, tertiary benefits to something like this that you could think about. Almost a prediction market of sorts for what true private market valuations are at scale, right? If you unpack some of the components, ultimately, as this gets easier for non-accredited investors to participate, it removes that structural disadvantage that retail investors have in getting access to early opportunities, potentially.
And the funds themselves have tokenized assets. So the stuff that we've seen before, if you're trying to begin to value those interests, we can begin to explore what we can do there. Explore what we can do there too.
Where can people learn more?
They can go to the DAO, the lao.io, lao.io, or they can check out our OpenLaw's Twitter feed, the Lao official's Twitter feed, or they can shoot me a note.
Excellent. Aaron, thanks again.
Thanks, Ryan.
We'll be in touch soon. And until next time, thank you everyone for joining in. We'll see you tomorrow for another epic interview as I'm getting back on track with all of these episodes and releasing them on iTunes and Spotify with the Brockworks Group folks. Until next time, peace.